There's a letter buried in the Bavarian state archives, a thin, yellowing page dated November 1919. On it, a mid-level civil servant scribbled a warning.
A movement is forming in Munich. If it spreads, the state will fracture, and the men leading it carry a fury I have never seen.
He mailed it. No one listened. They should have. The letter sat sealed for decades, forgotten behind layers of catalogue entries, political memos, and the debris of a collapsing empire. It was written by a quiet administrator named Ernst Vogel, a man whose job was simply to keep order in a city that had known none for months. But what he described, the gatherings in beer halls, the speeches that shook rafters, the young men huddled around a former corporal with burning eyes, reads today like a flare fired into the night. Vogel had no special training in politics. He wasn't a prophet or a strategist, but he understood one thing that few in 1919 grasped. Germany wasn't looking for a party. It was looking for a savior, or at least something that felt like one. And in the chaos of post-war Munich, a man could rise faster on rage than on reason. He described crowds swelling after sunset, storming into taverns already thick with anger. He wrote of soldiers returned from the front lines with shattered pride, desperate for someone to blame. He wrote of citizens caught between starvation and shame, convinced that the world had stolen their future. And in the center of it all was a new voice, gathering followers like sparks gather oxygen. When the letter surfaced decades later, historians viewed it as a curiosity. But read closely, it's something else, a snapshot of fascism before it had a name. To understand why that warning mattered, you have to picture Germany in the days after World War I. Not the clean photographs with the sharp uniforms, but the smell of rotting food in market stalls, the shouting in the streets, the aching humiliation that settled into every conversation.
Get back here.
Germany didn't just lose a war, it lost its identity. The Kaiser was gone, the empire was gone, millions were wounded, millions more were grieving. And the Treaty of Versailles hit like the aftershock of an earthquake. Crushing debt, territorial loss, foreign occupation, and most insulting of all, the claim that Germany alone was responsible for the war. It felt like a verdict on the national soul. Inflation devoured wages faster than they could be earned. Veterans lined up for work only to be told there were no positions available.
There is no work available today. Please move along so the next man can come forward.
Families tore old clothing into strips to make children's shoes. Revolutions flickered from city to city, red, black, and every ideology in between, like sparks from a derailed train. This wasn't the kind of collapse that arrives in an instant. It was a slow-motion unraveling, the type that leaves people longing for certainty, for order, for someone who could point at a culprit and say, there is who robbed you. That longing would become the soil from which fascism grew. While Berlin tried to act like a functioning government, Munich became a pressure cooker. It had been home to revolutionary uprisings, assassinations, and paramilitary groups who acted like they were independent nations.
This betrayal, this humiliation, proves we were stabbed in the back. We will have our revenge.
Every night, beer halls filled with men raging about betrayal, humiliation, and the belief that the true Germany had been stabbed in the back. These weren't places for quiet debate. They were arenas. Voices roared, fists slammed tables, the air shook with demands for vengeance. And it was in these rooms, dark, smoky, trembling with bitterness, that fascism found its first audience. Most people imagine fascism emerging as a polished ideology. It didn't. It started as a feeling. a mix of resentment, wounded pride, and the intoxicating thrill of belonging to a group that promised strength. A group that said, "You are right to be angry. You are right to feel cheated. Now let us show you who the enemy is." These halls were the birthplace of myths that would later become Nazi doctrine: the betrayal legend, the racial fantasies, the dream of national rebirth through struggle and violence. But in 1919, none of this had a coherent shape. It was raw, it was emotional, and it was looking for a leader. Or maybe a performer. When Vogel wrote about the young man with a voice that struck the room like an axe, he didn't know the name Adolf Hitler. Most people didn't. He was just a former soldier, drifting from place to place, living in hostels and railing against anyone he believed had sabotaged Germany's destiny. But what set him apart wasn't his anger. Munich was full of angry men. It was the intensity. The way he could turn a simple complaint into a sweeping indictment of entire institutions. The way he could transform personal humiliation into national tragedy. And perhaps most dangerously, the way he could make that tragedy sound reversible, if only people followed him. The first time he spoke publicly, he startled the room. Here was a man who didn't just shout. He sculpted emotion. His voice rose and cracked like it was tearing through something too small to contain it. Crowds didn't agree with him. They absorbed him. And he absorbed their energy right back. Movements don't begin with manifestos. They begin with moments. And Munich had just witnessed one. Vogel's letter described this early stage with eerie clarity. He didn't use the word fascism. Hardly anyone in Germany did. Italy had Mussolini, but his movement was still forming. What Vogel saw wasn't ideology so much as pattern. A group that offered simple answers to complex problems. A leader who embodied the crowd's rage. Enemies who were vague enough to be blamed for anything. And a promise of rebirth through unity and force. The movement Hitler joined, the German Workers' Party, was tiny at first. But it was a crucible of grievances, anti-Semitic paranoia, fear of socialism, hostility toward the Weimar government, and the belief that only extreme action could restore dignity. In that stew, fascism coalesced. One striking detail from Vogel's letter. He wrote that the men in the beer hall weren't arguing about politics. They were arguing about identity. What it meant to be German. Who was real. Who deserved to belong. And who should be removed. Identity politics fused with humiliation became the lever Hitler used to pry open an entire nation. By 1923, the movement believed it was unstoppable. The economy had collapsed again, this time into hyperinflation, so catastrophic families burned banknotes for heat because they were cheaper than firewood. The timing felt perfect. Hitler and his followers stormed the streets in the infamous beer hall putsch. They expected the army and police to join them. They didn't. The coup failed. Hitler was arrested. The movement fractured. From the outside, it looked like the end. History seemed to have rejected him. But from the inside, something else was happening. The myth began. Nothing energizes extremism like martyrdom, and Hitler in prison became exactly that. His trial became a stage, and he used it brilliantly, turning the courtroom into a theater of national grievance. Newspapers printed his speeches. Followers painted him as a man punished for patriotism. And behind bars, he had time to craft his ideology into something coherent, dangerous, and ready for mass consumption. Movements don't grow in straight lines. They grow in spirals collapsing, reforming, and tightening around moments of crisis. Germany had many more crises ahead, and Hitler was waiting for every one of them. Between 1924 and 1929, the Nazi movement rebuilt quietly. And here's the part textbooks often skip. Hitler didn't rise because he was brilliant. He rose because the system was brittle. Every institution, government, press, judiciary, society itself, underestimated him. Again and again. The Weimar Republic was young, fragile, and constantly negotiating its own legitimacy. Democracy felt like an experiment people weren't sure they'd signed up for. Political violence was common. Conspiracy theories spread faster than truth. And the belief that Germany needed a strong hand to restore order became widespread. This environment didn't create fascism, but it fertilized it. It made extremism sound practical. It made authoritarianism seem like a cure instead of a disease. Then came 1929, the global crash. Within months, Parliament was paralyzed, banks collapsed, and unemployment soared into the millions. Fear returned like a tidal wave. Fear is the currency of fascism. And Hitler spent it with expert precision. In the early 1930s, the Nazis transformed from a fringe group into a nationwide force. How? By mastering two tools, emotion and spectacle. They didn't persuade, they overwhelmed. Mass rallies, banners, uniforms, symbols. These weren't decorations, they were psychological weapons. Nazi propaganda turned suffering into a story, not just a tragedy, a betrayal narrative. One that placed Germany in the role of the fallen hero, surrounded by enemies. The pitch wasn't vote for us. It was join us, march with us, be part of Germany's resurrection. When economic misery met emotional theatrics, politics became theater. In 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in parliament. Hitler still didn't have power, but he had momentum, and momentum is often the last step before a system breaks. January 30th, 1933. Hitler was appointed Chancellor, not through revolution, but through political bargaining by elites who believed they could control him. It was the greatest miscalculation of the century. Within weeks, a fire tore through the Reichstag building. Hitler seized the moment like he'd been waiting for it his entire life. He declared an emergency, suspended freedoms, arrested political opponents, dismantled the constitution piece by piece. This is how fascism wins. Not by marching through the front gate, but by persuading the guards to open it. The final line of Vogel's 1919 letter reads, "If this spirit is allowed to grow, it will not stop at Munich. It will not stop anywhere." He was right, it didn't. And the world paid the price. But the letter teaches something more subtle, something unsettling. Fascism didn't begin with a dictator. It began with a mood. A fracture, a crowd looking for someone to explain their suffering. And a man who stepped into that fracture with a voice sharp enough to cut history in half.